As Courthouse of Cavan County Council, I am delighted to introduce the first in a series of special webisodes produced by Cavan's new historian in residence, Dr. Brendan Scott, as part of the Decade of Centenaries Commemorations. The podcast is presented by Cavan County Council in association with the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media. Dr. Scott has put together a fascinating series of lectures, exhibitions, podcasts and webisodes to explore this formative period in Irish history. And on behalf of Cavan County Council, I would like to thank him for lending his considerable expertise to the task of shaping the discussion around the important commemoration. I encourage everyone in Cavan to engage with this programme so that we might all gain a better understanding of these seismic events, which continue to impact Irish society to this day. Thank you and enjoy the lectures.
Hello everybody, my name is Brendan Scott and I am the historian in residence for Cavan County Council. As part of the Decade of Centenaries programme, I'm going to be recording a number of these short webisodes in which I'm going to be discussing the various events, people and themes which arise in Cavan during the early 1920s. And the first of these that I'm going to be looking at is the death of Captain Tom Sheridan of Ballinagh from injuries received while in action in May 1920. So if we just, I'm going to share the screen here. So Thomas Sheridan of Drumcrow in the parish of Kilmore was baptised on the 6th of October 1897. His parents' names were John Sheridan and Mary Delaney. Thomas's sponsors were James Sheridan, John's brother, and Mary Delaney, who was probably his maternal grandmother. As is often the case with civil registrations, Thomas's birth was actually registered as having taken place on the 25th of October, so almost 3 weeks after he'd been baptized. This was because this is quite regular at this time because fines would be issued for late registrations. So people would push the birth date to a later date than was actually the case. The church record is generally the more accurate. And if Thomas was baptized on the 6th of October, then it's likely he was born either that day or perhaps the day before. In the civil registration, Thomas's father, John, is listed as a farmer, and his mother's name is actually recorded as Margaret in it, not Mary. James Sheridan, John's brother, was listed as being present at the birth, which seems to have taken place at home, which again was not terribly unusual. And Tom was to be the eldest of 5 children, 4 boys and 1 girl. And we have a photograph here of Tom as a young man. This comes from a book written by Tom's brother Sean, What If the Dream Came True? But by the time Thomas, or Tom as he became known, had reached adulthood, he was living with 2 of his uncles on his mother's side, Thomas and Patrick Delaney, in Drumrooski. Tom joined the IRA, the Drumbraid Company of the Ballinagh Battalion, where he attained the rank of captain, and he was aged 23 in 1920. A plan was formulated to hold up an RIC car on Thursday, the 27th of May, which was travelling over to Crostony, it was a fair day in Crostony that day. So they were going to take the officers' uniforms and their weapons, and by doing so, they hoped to gain entry into the barracks in Ballinagh itself. Now, the 2 RIC men, Sergeant Johnson and Constable Somerset, were travelling to Crostony at about 10 a.m. when they were stopped by Tom Sheridan and his brother, volunteer Packy Sheridan. They'd been there since about 9:30 that morning, waiting for them. Called to surrender, the RIC men refused to do so, and instead Sergeant Johnson opened fire and shot both Tom and Packy. The sergeant was then wounded in the thigh by Tom, but managed to hold on to his weapon. The RIC men seemed to have made it away, at least a short way down the road, but they were detained by volunteers further down the road. Sergeant Johnson himself was brought to a Dublin hospital to be operated on for his wounds. He appears to have recovered fully. The Anglo-Celt, reporting on the incident about a week later, noted that it is freely stated that the attackers had no intention of shooting the policeman, and this is something which Tom's younger brother Sean believes cost Tom his life, that Tom was slow to engage in fire with the RIC men. Now, Tom managed to crawl into a nearby field to safety, but Packy had a leg injury and was unable to move. A horse and trap, which was en route to Crostony Fair, which was owned by a fellow volunteer, a guy called Tommy Connolly, came on the scene and immediately helped the two stricken men. Packy was brought away first, and then Tom was brought to a safe house where he was prayed for by two priests there. Calling for medical help was never considered, as this would have been tantamount to handing Tom over to the authorities. Other policemen were searching in the fields around the safe house, only a couple of fields away. And so Tom, who was conscious and talking at this time, but in a lot of pain and losing blood, was transported initially by horse and trap and then by a motor car to Longford. Speaking in 1962, Sean McGowan, and we'll have a look at Sean there, who was a Longford volunteer who brought the Sheridans to Dublin, said of Tom that I want to pay a special tribute to his courage and patience in his great suffering. Although in intense pain, there was no complaint from Tom Sheridan. And you can imagine how uncomfortable it must have been on a horse and trap, being jolted about on the roads and in a car when, you know, he was very badly hurt. So you can imagine it must have been terribly painful and uncomfortable for him. Early Friday morning, Tom was admitted to the Mater Hospital under the pseudonym. There's a bit of disagreement over whether the pseudonym was under the pseudonym of Tom Murphy from Kilkenny. Although Sean McGowan, again 42 years after the event in 1962, recalled that he checked Tom in under the name Tom Johnson from Ballongford, which was an amalgamation of Ballinallee and Longford. The surgeon stated later at Tom's inquest that he had examined Tom on Friday morning at 8 a.m. and found him suffering from wounds in the abdomen and thigh, and also from peritonitis, and that the case was hopeless and inoperable. It was too late for Tom, and he died on Friday from toxemia and the abdominal wounds. Tragically for his parents, they arrived too late, and Tom had died by the time they got to the hospital. They'd been brought to Dublin on the Saturday and arrived at the Mater at 11 o'clock that morning to be told the awful news. From there, they went to Jervis Street, where they visited their other son, Packy. Packy had been checked into the hospital on Jervis Street, but they didn't tell him of Tom's death for fear of setting him back, because he was quite badly injured as well. The civil registration of Tom's death, and the death was registered in Dublin because that's where he died. His address was registered as Drumrusk, Ballinya, County Cavan. He was noted to be a bachelor and a farmer's son, and his death, as I've said, was due to toxemia following peritonitis due to a bullet wound. The registrar noticed that he had received this information from Louis A. Byrne, who was the coroner for the city of Dublin, following the inquest into Tom's death, which was held on the 31st of May, 1920. A post-mortem uncovered 3 wounds, although Tom's brother Sean, and Sean McGowan himself as well, stated later that Tom was actually shot 5 times. One of these wounds had been stitched prior to Tom's arrival at the hospital, so they'd obviously tried to do some sort of work on him, probably on the more serious wounds, en route up to Dublin, which again, you can only imagine how painful that must have been. After the post-mortem, an RIC officer called Finnegan, who was from Cavan, visited the mortuary and identified Tom, because remember, Tom had been admitted under a pseudonym. As I say, Packy was in Jervis Street Hospital, and he was in a serious enough condition to be kept there for 6 weeks. But there was to be no easy convalescence afterwards for Packy, and he was forced to go on the run until the signing of the truce in 1921. Now, the RIC obviously knew who had held them up, as the Sheridan family home in Drumcrow was set alight by unidentified forces that night, with a number of the family inside. The Anglo-Celt reported that the night of the shooting, a party of disguised men visited the residence of John Sheridan in Drumcrow, and according to Sean, the younger brother, this happened at about 1 in the morning. You can imagine the family were still probably up, worrying about what was going on with the 2 boys. Tom's father, John, was brought outside and he was questioned, and then he was pushed roughly back into the house. The men ordered everybody in the house not to leave for an hour or they would be shot. The thatched roof was then set alight, allegedly with petrol. and several yards of the thatch was destroyed before the fire was brought under control. And this obviously caused a great deal of resentment in the area towards the RIC and to the Crown forces. Tom's remains were transported by rail to Crestoni Station, where a crowd of over 1,000 people were waiting. His coffin was carried on the shoulders of his comrades for 2.5 miles to the church, arriving there at midnight, where the parish priest, Father James Coyle, recited the rosary. Tom's funeral, again, as would be expected, was a massive affair, reckoned by Father Coyle to have been the largest he had ever officiated at, attended by over 5,000 people, including 1,500 volunteers and 300 members of Cumann na mBan. At his funeral, Father Coyle noted that Tom was a good boy, innocent, decent, and inoffensive, and he did not go there with the intention of doing any harm. Tom's coffin was draped with the tricolour, and 3 volleys were fired over the coffin by his bereaved comrades. In May 1922, a memorial was again held at Tom's grave in Ballinagh, and his mother later was granted a £40 dependence gratuity. But the Sheridan family story doesn't end there. Another of the Sheridan brothers, Michael, was imprisoned during the War of Independence and was elected to the Dáil as a Fianna Fáil TD in 1933, and was re-elected at every subsequent general election until 1961, when he retired from politics. An impressive memorial, and we have a picture of it here, an impressive memorial on the roadside at the spot where the men were shot, in the shape of a Celtic cross, was erected in 1962 by, as the stone says, his comrades, officers and men, Ballinagh Battalion IRA. And the memorial reads, and you can see it on the right-hand side, to the memory of Captain Thomas Sheridan, Ballinagh Battalion, Cavan Brigade, Irish Republican Army, who was mortally wounded at this spot on the 27th of May 1920, fighting for his country's freedom, and died on the 29th of May 1920, aged 23 years. The memorial was unveiled by Sean McGowan. By then, Sean was a TD. And also present at the unveiling were Tom's brothers Michael and Packy, and Sean was there as well, his sister Annie, and Father Corr, who was one of the priests who attended to Tom following a shooting. Tom's death and the circumstances around them are important in Cavan because the engagement which led to Tom's death was the first of its kind to occur between the IRA and the police forces in Cavan, and it pointed to an escalation in violence which was engulfing the island of Ireland and Cavan as well. And he was also memorialized in another statue which would be familiar to many people as well, which is the one outside the courthouse in Cavan town. Thomas is memorialized on that particular statue as well, which I think was put up, erected in the late 50s, I think. And if anyone is interested in further reading about Tom, you can read his brother's really interesting book, What If the Dream Came True. Johann Farrelly wrote a great book a couple of years ago, Royalists, Rebels and Revolutionists, A History of County Cavan's Revolution, 1912 to 23. You can also take a look in the Anglo-Celt for the reports of what happened. And a more recent book, and a really brilliant piece of work, is by Ewan O'Halpin and Daithí O'Curran, and that's The Dead of the Irish Revolution, which is everyone who was killed during that period of revolution in Ireland. And you can also, for some of the genealogical information that I got from the Roots Ireland website, the data on the Roots Ireland website for Cavan comes from Cavan Genealogy Service as well. So I just want to say a thank you as well to Cavan County Council for funding this project, and to Cavan Library Service in particular, and in particular within that Emma Clancy, the County Librarian, and Jonathan Smith as well, who have been great help. So as I say, it's a sad story of a young man who died too soon, and unfortunately there are many similar stories to that, not in Cavan but elsewhere as well throughout the country, and we're going to be looking at some of those stories going forward as well. So thank you very much for your time.